Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is Mike Trippy, aka Johnny Rush, for another live stream session of our Unity 3D game development project, Harvest. And we're going to go over some of the improvements and um, items that were completed in our player inventory system. On the last stream, I believe we left it off with working on the pickup code, and we had a few minor issues going on, but it was picking up some items. But all that's been ironed out. Um, so we do have a working pickup system. Um, Let me try to decide whether I'm going to show the code first or the actual working example. But let me quickly go over, the pickup really. We had this inventory item attributes file, and I made some changes to it as well as the inventory item. Originally, as you can see, I commented them out. I set up these public properties with the get and set items on each of these, and had it in a separate file. Where apparently, through trial and error and research, um, you can't easily display those items in um, basically in the inspector. And so I had to make some changes and some decision really on, do I want to complicate things or keep it simple? And we're aiming for simplicity here. There are ways to allow these to show up in the inspector so that the values can be set on each item. I tried to do it through a function that I had called set defaults for item, but where it needed to be called, and there were certain things that just weren't carrying over. It was acting really quirky, and I may have had a bug somewhere, but I don't think so. I've spent hours and hours looking at this. It's as simple as it possibly could be. So I went back really to what I originally had, which was having these fields here in the inspector, and that seemed to clear up a lot of the issues that I was having. So we have those changes that were made. It was simplified. Basically, the inventory item is still a separate file, separate class file. It's not inheriting from the base class model behavior, so it's just a standard C# class with our public variables. And in the inventory item attributes, we still have our reference to that class by creating this class object called inventory item as item. And that's set up. And these serialized fields allow us to see those inside the inspector. So if I quickly jump to the inspector, and that actually is on our item prefab, so master inventory, go to ammo box, for example. You'll see that these items are now showing up here, as well as a sprite that can be set right here. The sprite is going to be used in the player inventory screen when it pops up. So I added that as well, and whether the item is allowed to be picked up or not. So those are the two things that were added. We had these other fields before, these other properties, so I added these additional two. And I've already set all these up. If you look at each of these, all the values are set. One of the changes I did make, and I think we mentioned in the last one, was on the attachments, like for the mag and the silencer, because I wanted them to display in a certain attachment box in the inventory. I had to add, separate the attachment category to be more specific to attachment 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the 4 that we have. If we go back, so you see on the mag, it's actually set to attachment 4. And the silencer is set to attachment 1. I don't have an attachment 2 or 3 yet. 2 being the scope, 3 being like a laser sight. So we'll look at adding those later on. But I went ahead and set up the code in such a way that it supports an attachment 2 and 3. All right, sorry about that minor silence there. I had a cat that seemed like it was in distress, caught up in something, but he wasn't. He was just making some noise. Anyway, so yeah, the attachment system has been set up with 4 categories, attachment 1 through 4. If we look at, let's go to the prefabs folder. This is where I have the player UI. Now you really can't see it here, but we're going to demonstrate it in game. But I think we showed it in our last stream, so you'll get the basic layout. Let me go ahead and hit play here real quick. And we'll hit I. I toggles our inventory system up. And here we have on the left side, you've got these boxes right here, and actually the background's moving. As I move, it's moving. We have the, this is the attachment 1 box, attachment 2, primary weapon, attachment 3, attachment 4. And then down here is our secondary weapon. And we have our quick slots up top. Which of course, all these, if it's a stackable item, we've got in the top left corner a way to track those quantities as they're stacked. And then we have 16 additional slots here. So I will toggle that back off. So that's the when I refer to the attachments section of that screen, that's where it's at. So let's jump back to the code. So that basically, I mean, the code, it really didn't change too much on the inventory item attributes, other than the fact that we had to serialize the field, and for that, now we also added, I don't know if I had this before, but we have this on trigger enter, on trigger exit, and on trigger stay. And what I added to that was this particle system, where when you approach an item, it'll be a little particle, like a glow, that will show up to let you know that you're within, you know, or come within a range of being able to pick up that item. So the item will actually have a glow around it, or near it. So hopefully around it, but I've got to tweak some of the settings, because some of the items, when they spawn in, their center point is not the center of the item, so I just need to double check a few and make sure I've got the glow centered on those. So I'll demonstrate that in a minute. And then the actual pickup was done through, under our inventory manager. I'm sorry, the UI player inventory manager is where we have our add item function, which we went over before. And so that's pretty much the same. There were a few changes I made. As you can see, I commented out some code, some things I didn't need after the properties were set in the inspector for the items, for our prefabbed master inventory items. Some of this code was not needed to get references to certain items or add stuff. So some of that's been commented out or modified. So we have our first check again to recap on what we did. We've got the switch statement that switches by the category to see, okay, the item we're passing in, what's its category, and based on its category, if it's an attachment 1, 2, 3, or 4, or primary weapon, or the secondary weapon, let's go ahead and specifically check to see if those slots are free, and insert that item in that particular slot in the player inventory. That's what that does. Now, and it sets a flag. Each of these will set, if it's able to set an item based on whether it's available or the slot is empty, it'll set this Boolean flag called be item added to true. And so if an item is added, we're logging a message, and then we're just returning out of this function. There's no sense in going through the rest of this. So we just return the value be item added back out to the calling function. Now, if it wasn't added, if an item was not added in the first 6 slots, which are the primary and secondary weapon plus attachments, then it could potentially go in the quick slots as a stackable item, or just in one of the other items into a new slot, or another slot, I mean, as a new item. So the first check we do is, if the item exists, can we stack it? And so we go through a loop starting at I equals 6, which equates to slot 7 in our player inventory screen, because again the array is 0 based, so we're skipping the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those first 6 elements, starting at element 6 in the array, which is slot 7 in the visual representation of that in the player inventory screen. So, and again, I'm logging messages so I know exactly what slot I'm stacking it in. And again, the check that it does is it checks, okay, first it says, it does a check, is the item name equal to, the item is the name of the item that's being added is equal to the current item name that is in this slot. If it is, then let's also check with this double and if the item can be stacked, is it stackable, item.stackable, then we go ahead and do the stackable code. We increment the stack count of this item, which again, we're just incrementing the value that's in our array, which is the data representation for the player inventory screen. We're always updating the data representation in the background, and through the update functions, we'll build the UI every frame to show what it looks like. But anyways, we're tracking the data and updating it. We set the B item added to true, log a message just for debugging purposes, and then we return out of this function the add item function, because we no longer need to go any further. Once we stack the item, we don't want it to add as a new item later, so we return out. And so lastly, if the item was still not added, because it wasn't stacked, basically didn't find that item already in there, so we're not going to stack it. We're going to add it as a new one. So again, we just search through, starting at item 6, index 6. We go through, this loop will go through, and this statement here, the if statement, is just checking, okay, if the item name in the data array that we have set up for the player inventory, the item name is equal to basically string.empty, or it's an empty string, which means nothing's been assigned there, then it's a free slot that we can add item to. So that's what we'll do. We'll basically just assign the item that's being passed into this add item function to the item property of the array element, inventory I, and we increase its stack count, which is essentially, the new item starts at 0. So we just increase it just to show 1. And we say B item added equals true. So we did add an item, return out. We don't necessarily have to do that, because that is the last part of the process here, and it will return out. And so if we later added some functionality, though, after this that mattered, it's good to just return out at that point, so we're not doing anything further. And I just realized this line here, which I was using just to output the player inventory each time, no longer shows, so we can just comment it out. We're no longer showing it since it's always being returned out. It really is never going to reach this line based on our current logic. The only way it would reach it, let's do this, is actually it does reach it at one time. In the beginning, let's scroll up here. If it's been initialized in the inventory, if it's not equal to null, basically if we had an error where the inventory was not equal to null, or it was equal to null, basically it's empty, or it has not been initialized, and it would show that initially, and it does in the beginning. Just log it out to show it's uninitialized, but we no longer need to see that. We can just comment that out. All right, so that's our function that handles adding the item to the inventory. So let's go back to the inventory item, and that's kind of where it happens. Is, we've got this untrigger enter. We display the particle system glow. We turn that on, and on exit we stop it. This gets a reference to the particle system that's been attached. If we go to the item, I'll just take a look here real quick. It's recompiling every time I switch out of the Visual Studio. It'll recompile, so bear with me 1 second. Oh, I'm sorry. Inventory item attributes. Yeah, there we go. Let's go. Yeah, we should have a particle system on there. Let me go back. It should, unless I'm missing it. I may have added it to the item spawns, and that's what I wanted to check. Nope, it's not there. So let's delete that. Yeah, it was on the let's expand an item out. Yeah, there it is. I forgot. It's actually a separate component. It's like a child object of that. That's why it didn't initially show up when I clicked here. It's a separate one. And I'm not really going to go over some of this, but there were certain settings I configured, to get it to do the glow. The main thing that mattered was on the emission. I enable that and disable it by using a stop and play option. And I have it looping, so it's a continual, and a start size of 2. So you can play around with some of those in the duration. There's a lot of effects you can do with this particle system, and that's like a whole another topic. I kind of just researched what I needed to do, how to make a glow, and I configure this the way I needed it to make that glow happen. So again, we're not going to go over that in this video, but what I did want to show that there was the pickup system is now working. One last part of the code I want to show you is it's in the UI player inventory manager, and that's our display inventory function right here. This is it right here, display player inventory. When you hit I, that'll be called in, and it'll display the inventory when it pops up. So again, we have a loop. It's as simple as it's checking, okay, is the inventory initialized? We have this be_init, which is a private static variable that's up here. So if the player inventory, if it's at least been initialized, so that if it goes through this loop, even if it's putting empty placeholders in there, it can do it. If it's not initialized, it won't even go through this logic, this code. But we have a loop that goes through the length of the inventory array. So we have 26 items, so it'll go from 0 to 25. So that'll be 26 elements. I create a slot number so that I kind of use that in here, so I don't have to hard code any logic. But if you recall, we labeled our image placeholders for the player inventory screen as S1, S2, S3, S4, and so on, all the way up to S26. And so, since the array starts at 0, I'm creating the slot number based off of the current index of this loop, or the value of I, and adding 1 to it. And so that we can reference and get a reference to the image object that's within the player inventory screen. And so this is the way you do that through GameObject.find GameObject with tag. And that's the other thing. I went through and re-tagged all those S1 through S26 to actually have the tag that's the same as the object name. So I could use this function. This function. It seemed to be the simplest and most reliable way to find objects is by tag. Sometimes by name tends to work, or it doesn't work. I don't know what, occasionally it just does some quirky things occasionally. So I always recommend, if you're doing anything, I find that it works by tag 100% of the time without any hiccups. So you call that to get a reference to the image, and well, actually it's the main image. Under that image is a child component of the main slot number. So that's how I would retrieve the image component of this game object. and we store that in IMG, and then we check, you know, if IMG is null, which means it couldn't find it or get it, or maybe our code was wrong, it might be null, especially if you know it's there. And so it's retrieving a reference to that placeholder, the image placeholder. And so as long as it's not null, it's going to execute this. And actually, yeah, I had an issue here, a bug. I kind of left it here. I'm going to leave it just for reference so I don't make the same mistake in the future. But essentially the code here, this code right here, handles it all. We're reassigning the sprite that we're going to use using the resources.load sprites, and doing all that. Anyways, I got to go. Sorry to keep y'all holding up.